Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to be reading out an extract from my forthcoming book, Means and Ends, The Revolutionary Practice of Anarchism in Europe and the United States, which you can pre-order now. Today's extract is about the unity of means and ends. It goes as follows. Anarchists did not think that any form of activity could lead to an anarchist society. They argued that working class social movements should only use means that were in conformity with the ends of creating a free, equal, and cooperative society without domination or exploitation. They advocated the unity of means and ends. In 1881, Kropotkin argued that social movements should establish their final objective and then specify a proposed course of action in conformity with the ends. Anarchists like Malatesta often express this idea with metaphors of roads and bridges, transit and movement. He wrote, "It is not enough to desire something. If one really wants it, adequate means must be used to secure it, and these means are not arbitrary, but instead cannot but be conditioned by the ends we aspire to and by the circumstances in which the struggle takes place. For if we ignore the choice of means, we would achieve other ends, possibly diametrically opposed to those we aspire to, and this would be the obvious and inevitable consequence of our choice of means. Whoever sets out on the high road and takes a wrong turning does not go where he intends to go, but where the road leads him." Goldman made this same point in 1922 when she argued, in response to the Bolshevik seizure of state power during the Russian Revolution, that means cannot be separated from the ultimate aim, because the means employed become, through individual habit and social practice, part and parcel of the final purpose. They influence it, modify it, and presently the aims and means become identical. Given this, revolutionary methods must be in tune with revolutionary aims. The means used to further the revolution must harmonize with its purposes. In short, the ethical values which the revolution is to establish in the new society must be initiated with the revolutionary activities of the so-called transitionary period. The latter can only serve as a real and dependable bridge to the better life if built of the same material as the life to be achieved. Anarchism's commitment to the unity of means and ends was grounded in the theory of practice, which maintained, as we have seen, that as humans engage in activity, they simultaneously transform themselves and the world around them. An anarchist society would be reproduced over time by people engaging in horizontal systems of association and decision-making, and in so doing, continuously creating and recreating both anarchist social relations and themselves as people with the right kinds of capacities, drives, and consciousness for an anarchist society. These new social relations can only take root if capitalism and the state are abolished through a social revolution, and so will have to be created by the people who presently live in, and have been shaped by, class society. It is therefore essential that during the course of the class struggle, workers engage in practices that transform them into people who are capable of, and driven to, overthrow class society and establish and reproduce an anarchist society. If social movements make the mistake of using the wrong or inappropriate means, then they will produce people who will create a different society than the one they initially intended. This theory entailed two main commitments. First, a core part of determining what strategies and tactics a social movement should use to achieve their goals is establishing how the forms of practice that constitute them transform individuals and social relations simultaneously. If a social movement's end goal can only be achieved through a social revolution, then it must choose means during an evolutionary period that build towards this. Kropotkin argued in 1881 that workers should engage in direct struggle against capital, especially via trade unions and strikes, because of the unity of means and ends. he wrote. A party which proposes a social revolution as its goal, and which seeks to seize capital from the hands of its current holders, must, of necessity, and from this day onward, position itself at the centre of the struggle against capital. If it wishes that the next revolution should take place against the regime of property, and that the watchword of the next call to arms should necessarily be one calling for the expropriation of society's wealth from the capitalists, the struggle must, on all fronts, be a struggle against the capitalists. The second main position entailed by the unity of means and ends is that social movements must structure organizations and make decisions in a manner that causes participants to develop the kinds of radical capacities, drives, and consciousness that are necessary for producing and reproducing the social relations of the future society. A social movement organized in a hierarchical and centralized manner cannot create an anarchist society because it will not produce the right kinds of people for the task. Participants will either act in an authoritarian way or be subject to the authoritarianism of others, such as a small group of leaders monopolizing decision-making power and issuing orders that the membership then implements. This will result in the development of authoritarian tendencies in individuals and the establishment of authoritarian social structures that will, in turn, enable authoritarian modes of practice and constrain anti-authoritarian ones. If a social movement constituted by these self-reproducing authoritarian social structures were to launch or take over a revolution, the result would not be an anarchist society. The authoritarianism of the social movement would instead come to characterize society as a whole. Social movements that aim to create an anarchist society must therefore be constituted by forms of practice that produce self-determining people who associate horizontally with one another. In order to do so, workers must establish social relations in the present that are, as far as is possible, the same as those that would constitute an anarchist society. The unity of means and ends led anarchists to maintain that, although violence was necessary to defend the revolution from counterattack by the ruling classes, it should not be used to force the working classes into an anarchist society. In Bakunin's words, liberty can be created only by liberty, by an insurrection of all the people and the voluntary organization of the workers from below upward. As a result, a revolution that is imposed, either by official decrees or by force of arms, is no longer a revolution, but the opposite of a revolution, because it necessarily provokes reaction. Malatesta noted that anarchy cannot be made by force and violent imposition by a few, and is only possible when it is understood and wanted by large popular masses that embrace all the elements necessary to creating a society superior to the present one. There is, in other words, an incompatibility between the means of coercing people into a particular kind of society and the ends of creating a free society in which people voluntarily self-manage social life. A genuine social revolution can only occur if the majority of the population choose to participate within it and reorganize society themselves. For anarchists, means and ends are not only interconnected insofar as the means you engage in determine the ends you arrive at, they are also identical in the narrow sense that both the means and ends of anarchism are freedom. As Fabry wrote, the libertarian notion of revolution holds that freedom is also a means as well as an end. Anarchist actions, in other words, create freedom and are instances of freedom at the same time. This can be seen by connecting the anarchist conceptions of freedom, discussed in Chapter 3, to revolutionary practice. When the working classes collectively struggle against the ruling classes, they are not only fighting for a distant post-capitalist society in which humanity will finally be free, they are also rejecting domination in the present by choosing to act in accordance with their own wills, rather than obeying the wills of their masters and remaining subservient. When the working classes create organizations and social relations in which they horizontally relate to one another, they are both struggling for a future free society and creating a freer society in the here and now by expanding their real possibilities of experiencing a different kind of life and becoming a different kind of person. When the working classes engage in collective struggles or participate in horizontal social structures, they are developing themselves and becoming more free than they were before. Such a view was not inconsistent with the fact that the majority of anarchists thought violence was necessary to overthrow the ruling classes and defend the social revolution. Using violence to abolish the power of violent oppressors is not a negation of freedom, but rather an affirmation of it. As Malatesta put it, in order to fight our enemies, and fight effectively, we do not need to deny the principle of freedom, since a commitment to freedom entails the right to resist any violation of freedom, and to use brute force to resist when violence is based upon brute force and there is no better way to successfully oppose it. Anarchists wish to use violence to expropriate the economic ruling classes, not because freedom is a good thing for the future, but because it is always good, today as much as tomorrow, and the owners deprive us of it by depriving us of the means of exercising it. Anarchists likewise wish to use violence to overthrow the political ruling classes, because governments are the negation of freedom, and we cannot be free without having overthrown them. The anarchist commitment to the unity of means and ends led them to argue that working-class social movements should establish horizontal social structures that are, as far as is possible, the same as those that would constitute an anarchist society. In so doing, workers attempt to construct the world as they wish it to be during their struggle against the world as it is. They also create, through experimentation in the present, the real methods of organization and association that people in the future might use to achieve the states of affairs that characterize an anarchist society. Kropotkin, for example, argued in 1913 that anarchists have to find, within the practice of life itself, and indeed working through their own experiences, new ways in which social formations can be organized, and how these might emerge in a liberated society. During the second half of the 20th century, this idea was called prefiguration or prefigurative politics. It should be kept in mind that this term was not used by anarchists historically. Nonetheless, anarchist organizations generally prefigured the future anarchist society in two ways. First, by embodying the kinds of organizational structure and methods of deliberation and decision-making that a future society would contain. Second, by performing the kinds of functions that organizations in a future society will carry out. Although a social revolution would mark a dramatic shift in social life, there would be no such dramatic shift in anarchist methods of organization and association. The methods would remain the same. What would change is the context and the conditions under which these methods are applied, and so the extent to which they can be fully put into practice. Anarchist organizations built within class society thus have a dual function. In the present, they bring people together in order to directly satisfy unmet drives and struggle effectively against capitalism and the state. Through participating in anarchist organizations, workers simultaneously attempt to achieve concrete goals and develop their radical capacities, drives, and consciousness. A tenant union might not only organize a rent strike that wins a reduction in rent or prevents an eviction. The participants could also learn how to make collective decisions in general assemblies and act for themselves through their own direct action. At the same time, they might realize that tenants have shared class interests that are opposed to the class interests of landlords. During the course of the struggle, they begin to understand that society could be organized without landlords, and they may come to aspire for an economic system in which everyone has free access to housing. In changing the world, workers at the same time change themselves. During a revolutionary period, anarchist organizations would take on new roles and serve as the inspiration for emerging anarchist social forms and/or transform from organizations that struggle against class society into organizations that run a classless society. At such a point, they would not only be the dominant structures through which society was generally organized, they would also continually produce and reproduce individuals who want to and are able to freely associate as equals. The strategy of prefiguration was not original or exclusive to the anarchist movement. From the 1840s onward, a tendency within the French socialist movement had proposed the formation of workers' cooperatives as organizations that would grow in number under capitalism until they displaced capitalist firms and became the nodes of a socialist society. During debates within the First International, this idea was extended to the First International itself, including the trade unions affiliated with it. The Belgian internationalist Césaire de Pep, who was a collectivist but not an anarchist, proposed in his February 1869 article, The Present Institutions of the International in Relation to the Future, that the International already offers the model of the society to come, and its various institutions, with the required modifications, will form the future social order. For de Pep, the International contains within itself the seeds of all the institutions of the future. Let a section of the International be established in each commune, the new society will be formed, and the old will collapse with a sigh. The influence these ideas had on the developing anarchist movement can be seen in the fact that the article was republished in April 1869 in Le Progrès, which was edited by Guillaume, and in May 1869 by the official organ of the Romance Federation of the First International, Égalité, which Bakunin wrote for and edited at the time. One of the earliest anarchist endorsements of prefigurative politics occurred when, on November 12, 1871, the Jura Federation issued the Saint-Villers Circular in response to Marx, Engels and their supporters converting the General Council of the First International into a governing body that imposed state socialist decisions and policies on the organization's previously autonomous sections. As part of their critique of the actions of the General Council, they stated that the society of the future should be nothing other than the universalization of the organization with which the International will have endowed itself. We must, therefore, have a care to ensure that that organization comes as close as we may to our ideal. How can we expect an egalitarian and free society to emerge from an authoritarian organization? Impossible. The International, as the embryo of the human society of the future, is required in the here and now to faithfully mirror our principles of freedom and federation and shun any principle leading towards authority and dictatorship. Anarchists, in short, thought that building prefigurative organizations was essential because of the unity of means and ends. As Bakunin wrote a few months after the Saint-Villers Circular was published, the fashion and form of one's organization arises from and flows as a consequence from the nature of one's aims. Kropotkin likewise argued in 1873 that revolutionaries must reject social relations within the revolutionary organization that contradict the ideals for which it has been formed. Relations such as a hierarchy of ranks, which enslaves many people to one or several persons, or inequality in the interrelations of the members of one and the same organization. This was important because, as Malatesta explained, the abolition of government and capitalism is feasible only once the people, organizing themselves, are equipped to perform those social functions performed today and exploited to their own advantage by rulers and capitalists. To this end, anarchists like Goldman propose that workers in the present should attempt to prepare and equip themselves for the great task the revolution will put upon them, by acquiring the knowledge and technical skill necessary for managing and directing the intricate mechanisms of the industrial and social structure of their respective countries. Anarchist organizations that prefigured the future anarchist society were the concrete means through which workers would learn to self-manage their lives and thereby become equipped to create a self-managed society. As Meller wrote in 1911, "The proletariat continues acquiring the capacity for cooperation and management precisely outside of political action. In workers' associations, especially in those where political practices do not govern, workers are gaining the power of initiative, management practices, habits of freedom and direct intervention in common affairs, ease of expression and mental assurance, all things whose development is void in political entities that have as a base the delegation of powers, and therefore the subordination and discipline and obedience to the elected." In social associations, initiatives come from below, and from below come ideas, strength, and action. In this way, free men are made and are released to walk. Decades later, in 1932, the Spanish anarchist Isaac Puente argued that, just as a child learns to walk or ride a bicycle by trying and failing until they succeed, so too would workers learn to produce and reproduce an anarchist society through experiments in horizontal forms of association. He wrote, "Living in libertarian communism will be like learning to live. Its weak points and its failings will be shown up when it is introduced. If we were politicians, we would paint a paradise brimful of perfections. Being human, and being aware what human nature can be like, we trust that people will learn to walk the only way it is possible for them to learn, by walking." I hope you've enjoyed listening to this extract from my forthcoming book, Means and Ends: The Revolutionary Practice of Anarchism in Europe and the United States. You can pre-order it now. If you like my videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon so I can keep doing this full time. Thanks so much to everyone who has and continues to support me on Patreon. If you want to see me post random things, follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Have a nice day, everyone. Goodbye.